Hey guys! In tonight's video, we begin with the life of a third-class passenger aboard the Titanic. We dive into their living quarters, shower situation, dining, entertainment, and more. We also explore the less talked about passengers on the Titanic, the crew. What was living in the Titanic for them? We explore it all. But before we begin, please like and subscribe. Get in your comfy place, and let's get started. Imagine stepping into the most luxurious ship the world has ever seen, the RMS Titanic. Newspapers are calling it the ship of dreams, a floating palace that promises to carry thousands across the Atlantic in style. But you're not here for the gilded dining rooms, the grand staircases, or the string quartets. You're here because this ship represents something far more important: opportunity. For you, a third-class passenger, life hasn't been easy. Maybe you've left behind poverty in Ireland, crowded streets in Italy, or a small village in Eastern Europe. You carry with you only a few coins, a bundle of clothes, and a heart full of hope that in America, things will be different. You board not with servants or fine luggage, but with your family at your side in a dream of starting over. As you step into steerage, the air, it feels different. The ceilings are lower, the corridors narrower, and the hum of the engines a constant reminder that you are close to the heart of the ship. Yet there is laughter, music, and the chatter of dozens of languages. Children run between the bunks, mothers unpack bread and cheese from home, and young men talk excitedly about the lives they will build once they reach New York. This isn't the Titanic you see in the movies. The chandeliers and champagne are far above you. They're out of reach. But here, in the belly of the ship, is a world of its own. A world of crowded dormitories, shared meals, and unexpected joy. For the thousands in third class, Titanic is more than a passage across the ocean. It is a passage to possibility. Today we're stepping back in time to experience life aboard the Titanic, not as the wealthy elite, but through the eyes of those who traveled in third class, where every moment carried both hardship and hope. Now, who exactly were these people crammed into third class? Well, forget the image of somber, downtrodden immigrants staring sadly out to sea. Third class on the Titanic was like a floating international neighborhood. You had young Irish farmers who traded muddy boots for a chance at American soil, Italians hoping to open bakeries and fill New York with the smell of fresh bread, Scandinavians looking for work in the booming factories, and Eastern Europeans carrying everything they owned in a single trunk. And let's be honest, most of them weren't dreaming of becoming millionaires overnight. They wanted steady jobs, a roof that didn't leak, and maybe a little space where their kids could run around without bumping into 5 siblings. Basically, the American dream boiled down to, please just let my family live somewhere bigger and more than just one room. And as for their tickets, well, that's a story in and of itself. While first-class passengers were paying what amounted to the price of a luxury car today, third-class tickets, they were actually affordable. Shipping lines wanted their steerage full, so they cut deals left and right. Some passengers bought tickets through local travel agents, others through relatives who've already made it to America and scraped together enough to send money home. And then there were entire families who pooled every penny they had, just enough to snag the cheapest bunks at the very bottom of the ship. So yeah, third class was filled with dreamers, hustlers, and probably a few people who just wanted to get far, far away from their in-laws. They weren't chasing chandeliers and ballrooms. They were chasing new beginnings, and they were willing to spend a week below deck with strangers snoring in their ears if it meant a shot at a better life. So let's talk money. How much did it actually cost to sail third class on the Titanic? Well, brace yourselves, because it wasn't nearly as expensive as you might think. A one-way third-class ticket cost anywhere from £7 to £9. That's about $35 back then, depending on where you were sailing from. In today's money, that works out to roughly $1,200 to $1,500. Still a big purchase for working-class families, but not entirely impossible. By comparison, a first-class suite could run you over £870, the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars today. In other words, while the Astors were dropping the modern cost of a luxury sports car to float across the ocean in style, third-class families were scraping together the cost of, say, a budget laptop to cram themselves into steerage. So, what did your average third-class passenger expect before they ever stepped foot on the Titanic? Honestly, not much. Most of them were used to tough, crowded conditions on land and had heard stories about older immigrant ships where steerage meant damp, filthy rooms with rats, bad food, and very little dignity. Compared to that, Titanic was advertised like a dream. White Star Line bragged that even their cheapest passengers would have real beds, decent meals, and access to fresh air. Imagine hearing that in 1912, when many of these families were used to sharing one room back home with 5 siblings and a goat. The promise of 3 hot meals a day, mattresses instead of straw, and indoor plumbing must have sounded like luxury on the high seas. For many, Titanic wasn't just a way to reach America. It was the nicest place they'd ever stayed in their lives. Of course, expectation wasn't just about creature comforts. Emotionally, these passengers carried the weight of huge dreams. They expected America to be a land where a farmhand could become a landowner, where children could go to school instead of straight to the fields or factories, and where their futures weren't already written by poverty or class. The Titanic ticket wasn't just paper. It was a golden key to a fresh start. So you finally made it, ticket in hand, belongings stuffed into a trunk or a bundle, kids tugging at your sleeve. You're about to board the Titanic. This is it, the gateway to a whole new life. Now, first impressions? Well, that depends on who you are. If you're in first class, you're strutting across a gangway that basically feels like the red carpet at the Oscars. But in third class, you're funneled through separate entrances at the side of the ship, more like you're sneaking in through the servant's door at a fancy party you weren't actually invited to. And the sights and sounds? Oh, well, there's plenty. Dock workers shouting, families chattering in Irish, Italian, Swedish, you name it. Titanic steerage was a full-blown Tower of Babel on water. Kids are gawking at the sheer size of the ship, while parents are mentally calculating how many days of seasickness they can endure before regretting everything. Then comes the smell. On deck, there's a mix of salty ocean air, coal smoke belching from the funnels, and, well, the unique aroma of hundreds of people crammed together with all their worldly possessions. Let's just say it wasn't exactly lavender and roses. As you make your way down to the third-class quarters, things get cozier. Narrow passageways, whitewashed walls, the constant low rumble of the engines vibrating through the floor. If you were expecting mahogany paneling and chandeliers, well, surprise. Instead, you're greeted by rows of metal bunks stacked 2 or 3 high, thin mattresses, and a pillow that probably wasn't much thicker than a folded-up newspaper. But hey, at least it wasn't straw on the floor like on older immigrant ships. That's progress. And here's the kicker. Most third-class passengers weren't even disappointed. For them, these quarters, they actually felt nice. Clean sheets, electric lighting, proper bathrooms. Titanic steerage was practically a 3-star hotel compared to the floating cattle pens many immigrants had endured before. Sure, it was noisy, it was crowded, and it smelled faintly of boiled cottage, but for a lot of folks, this was already the fanciest place they'd ever been to. So, okay, let's dive into the nitty-gritty details now. So after boarding and winding your way down the narrow staircases and echoing corridors, you finally reach your home for the voyage, the third-class sleeping quarters. Now picture this. Long, whitewashed hallways lit by bare electric bulbs, which was fancy considering many steerage passengers came from homes that didn't have electricity yet. The walls were plain, no decoration, just utilitarian paint, but to some, even that cleanliness, it felt modern. When you opened the door to your cabin, you'd usually find a small, rectangular room packed with metal-framed bunk beds, stacked 2 or 3 high. Each bunk had a thin mattress, a pillow, and a blanket. Nothing luxurious, but when you're used to a straw mat back at home, suddenly, a mattress feels like sinking into clouds, or at least lumpy clouds. Privacy? Forget it. If you were traveling alone, you might end up sharing your cabin with complete strangers. Men bunked with men, women with women, and families were usually kept together, which meant entire groups crammed into these little spaces. Imagine trying to sleep while a baby is crying in one bunk, someone is snoring in another, and your neighbor's suitcase keeps falling off the bunk bed onto your head. Doesn't really sound that romantic. And then there was the constant noise of the ship. Being so low down, close to the engines and propellers, meant that your lullaby was the never-ending thrum of machinery mixed with the occasional clang of pipes and footsteps from the decks above. You didn't so much fall asleep as you eventually gave up trying to fight the vibrations rattling your bed. And the smell? Well, let's just say the quarters had character. A blend of damp sea air seeping through the metal hull, coal smoke drifting down from the funnels, and the unmistakable odor of a few hundred unwashed travelers. Add in the scent of boiled cabbage from the dining hall, and you've got yourself a fragrance Yankee Candle will never be able to sell. But here's the part most people don't expect. For third-class passengers in 1912, these quarters were considered a huge step up. Older immigrant ships often shoved hundreds of passengers into massive open dormitories with wooden bunks, straw on the floor, no ventilation, and rats running around like they own the place. Compared to that, the Titanic's cabins, with real walls, beds, and sheets that were actually changed, and electric lighting, it felt shockingly modern. For many passengers, this was the nicest accommodation they had ever lived in. Some Irish families wrote letters back home from the ship saying the steerage quarters were as nice as any hotel. Now, of course, those hotels came with snoring, seasickness, and the faint background music of someone throwing up in a bucket. But still, it beat home. So yeah, it was crowded, noisy, and smelled faintly like a cabbage-filled locker room. But it was also safe, clean, and for many, a glimpse at the modern world they hope to find in America. All right, so now you've dropped your trunk in your cabin, claimed the top bunk before your brother could, and now your stomach is growling. Time to head to the third-class dining saloon. First off, the room itself. No chandeliers, no elegant wallpaper, no white-gloved waiters. Instead, you walked into a long, plain hall filled with sturdy wooden tables and benches, bolted to the floor so they wouldn't slide around in rough seas. The walls were painted white, simple and easy to clean, and bare electric light bulbs dangled overhead. It wasn't fancy, but it was bright, tidy, and shockingly modern compared to the dim, grimy steerage dining rooms on older immigrant ships. Now for the good stuff, the food. Believe it or not, steerage passengers on Titanic ate better than on almost any other ship of its time. White Star Line prided itself on treating even its cheapest passengers with a bit of dignity, which meant 3 proper meals a day. No more surviving on stale bread and water like some 19th century shipwreck survivor. A typical day might look like this. Breakfast is oatmeal porridge with milk and sugar, bread with butter and marmalade, and a mug of tea or coffee. Not exactly eggs Benedict, but filling and warm. Lunch was typically a hearty soup, fresh baked bread, and sometimes meat pies or cold cuts. A step up from the whatever's left most immigrants were used to. And dinner? Dinner was usually stew with potatoes and veggies, maybe roast beef or pork if you were lucky, and pudding for dessert. Yeah, pudding. Steerage passengers also got dessert, which was practically a miracle. Food was served on real plates with actual cutlery, not ladled into bowls you brought yourself. That alone made people feel like they'd stepped into a world of modern travel. But of course, there were also some downsides. Meals leaned heavily on potatoes, bread, and cabbage, so after a week, you were probably dreaming of anything else. A piece of fruit, maybe, or something green that wasn't boiled within an inch of its life. And the dining hall itself, it smelled like exactly what you'd think. Stews, boiled veggies, and 700 hungry people squeezed together. Let's just say the word ventilation wasn't in heavy use. But here's the thing. For many steerage passengers, Titanic's meals were the best they'd ever eaten in their entire lives. For families used to going without meals for weeks, suddenly having it every day was astonishing. Some passengers later wrote that the food alone felt like luxury. Proof that life in America might really hold more abundance than they'd ever known. And unlike upstairs, where meals were stiff, formal affairs with more forks than anyone actually needs, steerage dining was loud, lively, and social. Kids ran between the benches, people swapped food with their neighbors, and everyone laughed and chatted over soup and bread. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like a community. So yeah, first-class passengers got oysters and champagne, but third-class passengers got something just as valuable. 3 hot meals a day, served with hope, noise, and maybe just a little bit too much cabbage. Believe it or not, there are actually surviving records of what was served in third class on the Titanic. White Star Line kept some pretty detailed notes, and some menus survived. Here are some real examples of what a third-class passenger might have eaten on board. So for breakfast, it would have been oatmeal porridge with milk, fresh bread with butter or marmalade, coffee or tea, and sometimes ham and eggs, but only on specific days. And dinner, well, I guess what we would call lunch today, was soup, often veggie or rice soup. They got fresh bread. They got roast beef with brown gravy, boiled potatoes, and plum pudding with sweet sauce. And for supper, it usually consisted of cold meat like roast pork or beef slices, cheese, pickles, fresh bread, and butter. And it's worth pointing out, this was fantastic food for third class in 1912. On many immigrant ships of the late 1800s, steerage passengers were told to bring their own food, hard bread, dried fish, maybe cheese if they were lucky. By contrast, Titanic gave its third-class passengers 3 cooked meals every single day. So while first class was dining on oysters, filet mignon, and French wine, Third class was thrilled just to get the hot soup, the fresh bread, and the pudding. Honestly, for a lot of steerage families, it was the most regular, plentiful food they had ever had in their lives. All right, now we have to talk about the bathroom situation because it's both funny and fascinating, and it really shows the difference between steerage life and upstairs luxury. And let's be honest, everyone wants to know about the bathrooms. You've got 700 plus third-class passengers packed into the lower decks of the Titanic, all eating 3 hot meals a day, heavy on cabbage and potatoes. So where exactly did they handle their business? Well, here's the scoop. Third-class passengers had access to about 80 toilets scattered around their decks. These weren't outhouses or buckets. They were proper, modern flushing toilets. That alone was a big deal. Many immigrant families came from rural areas where the family outhouse was the height of luxury. So imagine their surprise stepping onto the Titanic and finding a porcelain toilet that actually flushed. For some, it was their first encounter with plumbing that didn't involve a shovel. But here's the real kicker. There were only 2 bathtubs. 2. For all of third class. That's right. More than 700 passengers were expected to share 2 tubs. Unless you were sprinting straight to them the second the ship set sail, your odds of a nice soak were basically 0. Bathing became less about daily hygiene and more about don't stand too close to people who got seasick yesterday. And no, steerage didn't get fancy washrooms with marble counters and attendants like first class. Instead, they had simple wash basins in communal areas where you'd splash your face, rinse your hands, and hope nobody judged how many days you'd gone without a proper bath. Soap? Provided. Towels? Sometimes. Privacy? Not a chance. But here's the thing. Compared to older immigrant ships, this was still a luxury. On many Atlantic crossings, just 20 or 30 years earlier, steerage passengers might be stuck with only buckets for toilets and a shared pump for washing, often in the same room. The Titanic, by contrast, gave steering passengers actual running water, flushing toilets, and washrooms divided by gender. That might not sound like much today, but in 1912, it felt downright civilized. So yeah, first-class passengers were soaking in clawfoot tubs while being handed fluffy towels by their servants. Meanwhile, third class was lining up for the loo and hoping the person before them didn't take forever. But for the average immigrant, even standing in line for a flushing toilet felt like progress toward the modern life they were chasing in America. So you've got your bunk, you figured out where to line up for cabbage stew, and you've maybe even spotted the washroom. Now what? What did a typical day look like for a third-class passenger? Well, first off, you lived on Titanic time, not your own. The ship ran like a floating hotel crossed with military barracks, and everyone had to follow the same rules. Every morning, a steward would walk the corridors to make sure you were awake, and here's the fun part, to inspect your cabin for cleanliness. That's right. Even though you'd paid for your ticket, you were still expected to keep your quarters neat and tidy, or risk a stern talking to. Basically, it was like living in a dorm where someone checked to see if you'd made your bed every single morning. Meals were the anchor points of the day: breakfast, dinner, and supper. And the stewards made sure everyone ate at set times. No wandering into the dining saloon at noon for brunch with a mimosa. You ate when they told you to, with the people at your table, and that was that. Between meals, life was a mix of socializing and restrictions. third-class passengers weren't allowed to freely wander the ship. The grand staircase? Forget it. The first-class promenades? Off limits. Even the second-class smoking rooms were barred. Steerage had its own designated spaces, and crew members made sure you stayed in them. Think of it as the world's fanciest cruise, with invisible velvet ropes you weren't allowed to cross. There were also health inspections. Remember, 1912 was still an era where people worried about immigrants carrying diseases into America. So passengers in steerage had to pass basic medical checks, both before boarding and again during the voyage. If you looked sickly or developed something suspicious while on board, it could mean trouble when you reached Ellis Island. That fear alone kept people on their best behavior, trying not to cough too much at dinner. Of course, daily life wasn't just rules and inspections. Kids spent their days running through corridors or playing games on the small open decks allowed to steerage, while adults gossiped, swapped stories, or played cards. The hum of the engines, the vibration of the ship, and the constant shuffle of people gave the lower decks a sort of never-ending background soundtrack. So what did a typical day feel like? Imagine a cross between a boarding school, a crowded hostel, and a family reunion where everyone speaks a different language. Structured, noisy, and sometimes smelly, but underneath it all, full of excitement, because every sunrise on Titanic brought you one day closer to America. All right, so after a day of inspections, set meal times, and being politely told you're not allowed upstairs, how did third-class passengers actually have fun? Well, here's the surprise. Steerage was probably the most lively, entertaining part of the Titanic. Even though third class didn't have orchestras, smoking lounges, or promenades lined with deck chairs, what they did have was energy. Passengers brought their own music with them, fiddles, flutes, accordions, and voices, and by the end of most evenings, the third-class dining saloon had transformed into a dance hall. Picture this: Irish passengers stomping out jigs, Italians singing folk songs, Scandinavians clapping along to polkas, Eastern Europeans showing off traditional dances. It was noisy, chaotic, and joyful. A kind of international block party in the belly of the ship. Where else could you find a fiddler from Galway, a singer from Naples, and a Hungarian family, all taking turns entertaining the crowd? The atmosphere was wildly different from first class. Upstairs, people sipped champagne and politely applauded string quartets. Downstairs, you had children shrieking with laughter, adults clapping on time, and dancers practically shaking the bolts loose from the floor. If Titanic had not hit an iceberg, you can bet the steerage parties would have been the most talked about part of the trip. Games were also popular. Cards, checkers, and simple pastimes like storytelling filled the long hours. For kids, even the narrow corridors became playgrounds, which surely drove some parents insane after the third game of tag through the bunks. And then there was the socializing. Steerage was full of people in their teens and 20s, traveling alone or with friends. And well, when you cram hundreds of people together with not much else to do, there's bound to be some flirting. Titanic was less ship of dreams and more ship of awkward pickup lines for plenty of third-class passengers. But beyond the music and the dancing, there was a deeper sense of connection. People bonded over shared dreams, swapped stories of home, and even taught each other words in their native languages. For many, it was the first time meeting people from countries they'd only ever heard of. In that way, Steerage wasn't just a passage to America. It was a cultural exchange, powered by music, laughter, and a little too much cabbage. So while first class had chandeliers and champagne, third class had something far better: life, laughter, and community. If you wanted to experience the Titanic at its most human, you wouldn't go to the grand staircase. You'd go down to steerage and join the dance. It's now April 14th, 1912. The Titanic has been sailing smoothly for 4 days, and down in steerage, life is settling into a rhythm: meals, music, chatter, and the steady hum of the engines lulling everyone to sleep. It's late at night, around 11:40 p.m., when most passengers are either in bed or still laughing and dancing in the dining saloon. And then it happens. At first, no one in third class even realizes anything's wrong. When the iceberg scrapes the hull, the sound is muffled by the layers of decks above. What you hear instead is a strange, distant grinding noise, maybe a shudder through the bunks, like the ship just hit a giant pothole. People glance around, confused. Most shrug it off. After all, this is the unsinkable Titanic. What's a little bump? But soon the mood shifts. Stewards begin moving through the corridors, knocking on doors, and telling people to get up, put their life jackets on, and head on deck. Which sounds simple until you realize you're in the lower levels of the largest ship ever built, with a maze of narrow passageways, locked gates separating different classes, and signs written in English that not everyone can read. Confusion? It spreads quickly. Some passengers grab their valuables, others their children, while a few stubbornly stay in bed, convinced it's just a drill. And then there's the cold. As families make their way towards the staircases, they feel the air growing sharper, the chill of the North Atlantic seeping into the ship. Steerage corridors echo with dozens of languages as people ask the same questions. Where do we go? Is it serious? Are we safe? The problem is, no one down here has clear answers. Some passengers are met with locked gates, part of the ship's design to keep steerage separate from second and first class. Stewards eventually unlock them, but precious time is lost. Imagine being a mother with children in tow, hearing the distant panic from above, and finding yourself stuck behind an iron gate that won't budge. By the time steerage passengers finally reach the upper decks, the lifeboats are already being filled. And here's the brutal truth. Lifeboat space was limited, and priority was given to first and second class. Steerage families often arrived too late, forced to wait, while spaces went to those who had paid for luxury suites. For many, the journey through Titanic's lower decks felt like a race against time, one where the odds were stacked against them. The chaos is hard to overstate. Imagine hundreds of people cramming staircases, clutching children, shoving trunks, tripping over life jackets that didn't quite fit, shouts in Swedish, Italian, Irish, Hungarian, all blending into one desperate sound. Some steerage passengers broke down doors or climbed ladders to reach the decks. Others never found their way out at all. And yet, through the fear, there were moments of courage. Fathers trying to push their wives and children forward, young men stepping aside to let families through, people singing hymns to steady their nerves, hope mixed with panic, order mixed with chaos. For steerage passengers, the Titanic sinking wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cruel betrayal. They had boarded a ship that promised them safety, dignity, and a fresh start. But in the most critical hours, they discovered what they had suspected all along. They weren't treated as equals. Before we carry on with the sinking itself, let's stop for a moment and look at the cold, hard numbers. Because if you ever needed proof that your class on Titanic decided your fate, here it is. In first class, about 62% survived. Men, women, and especially children had a much better shot here thanks to early access to lifeboats and crew prioritizing them. In second class, around 41% survived, not as privileged as the Astors, but still better positioned than those below. In third class, only 25% survived. That means 3 out of every 4 steerage passengers never made it off the ship. And if you zoom in even closer, third class women, about 46% survived, almost half. Third class men, only 16% survived. That's fewer than 1 in 6. And third class children, just 34% survived, which is especially tragic when you remember that almost every single first and second class child lived. So why the huge gap? Well, it was a brutal mix of factors. Delayed access to the decks, language barriers, locked gates, and the fact that by the time many reached the lifeboats, many of the seats were already gone. Add in the women and children first policy, which in practice often meant first and second class women and children. Third class families were left scrambling in chaos. So yeah, the Titanic may have been marketed as the ship of dreams, but when it came to survival, your dream depended heavily on the kind of ticket you could afford. By the time reality sank in, the Titanic was doomed. Steerage was already in chaos. Families stumbled through the narrow corridors, some barefoot, some clutching children wrapped in blankets. The cold of the Atlantic seeped into every space, turning breath into mist and making life jackets feel like frozen boards against their chests. Some never even made it out of their cabins. Titanic's lower decks were a maze, and in the panic, people became disoriented, lost in a ship they hadn't had the freedom to explore. Locked gates and confusing stairwells meant precious moments were wasted. By the time crew members opened the barriers, water was already flooding in behind them. For those who did fight their way upward, the sight on deck was surreal. Lifeboats were being lowered half empty, while hundreds still crowded the railings. Steerage families watched, stunned, as spaces went to first-class passengers who had strolled calmly to the boats earlier in the night. Mothers clutched babies, begging in broken English for a chance to board. Young men tried to force their way forward, only to be shoved back by crew. And then came the moments of heartbreaking choice. Fathers pushing wives and children ahead, knowing they'd never follow. Brothers lifting sisters into boats before stepping back into the crowd. Some men tried to disguise themselves, slipping into lifeboats under the chaos. A few succeeded, but most didn't. As the ship listed more sharply, the steerage decks became scenes of both despair and defiance. Some passengers prayed, kneeling in groups as water crept closer. Others sang hymns, voices quivering but steady. And yeah, some simply sat down, numb, clutching their few belongings, unable to believe the unsinkable Titanic was actually going under. When the last lifeboat was lowered, more than 1,000 people remained trapped on board, most of them from third class. They surged toward the stern as the boat dipped under the water, clinging to railings, praying for a miracle. The great ship tilted higher and higher, the lights flickered, and suddenly they were out. The Titanic, once the greatest vessel in the world, snapped in two with a roar that echoed across the Atlantic. For those still on board, the plunge into the freezing water was instant death for many. The ocean was just above 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to paralyze in less than 1 minute. Survivors described the cries of hundreds of voices rising into the night, a sound so terrible that it haunted them for the rest of their lives. Most of those voices belonged to third-class passengers, who had never been given a fair chance to escape. Out of the more than 700 steerage passengers, only about 178 survived. The rest, fathers, mothers, children, dreamers bound for America, vanished into the North Atlantic before ever catching sight of the Statue of Liberty. We've walked into the shoes of third-class passengers, the dreamers, the families, the hopeful immigrants chasing a better life across the Atlantic. But steerage wasn't the only world hidden in Titanic's lower decks. Beneath even their cabins, behind doors most passengers never saw, lived another group of people whose lives were tied to the ship in a very different way. These weren't travelers heading to America. They weren't on board for any adventure, or for luxury, or for dreams of a new start. They were the men and the women who kept Titanic alive. For the passengers, the ship was a marvel of modern engineering. For the workers, it was their workplace, a hot, noisy, back-breaking environment where the pay was low, the hours were endless, and the margin of error was razor thin. While first-class passengers sipped champagne under crystal chandeliers, these workers were shoveling coal in sweltering boiler rooms, polishing brass until it gleamed, and serving meals with military precision. And the strangest part, most of them would never even set foot in America. When Titanic docked in New York, many crew members were scheduled to turn right back around and make the return voyage to England. Their Titanic story wasn't about hope or dreams. It was about duty, survival, and hard labor. So, as we leave behind the crowded bunks and lively dances of third class, let's head deeper into the belly of the ship. Let's step into the world of the stokers, the stewards, the firemen, the cooks, the maids, and the engineers, the invisible backbone of the Titanic. If third class was the heart of Titanic's humanity, then the service staff were its hands, always busy, always moving, and almost invisible. These were the stewards, stewardesses, cooks, waiters, and maids, whose entire job was to make sure passengers saw only the glamour of the ship and none of the hard work happening behind the scenes. Their day started early. While first-class passengers were still dreaming under feather-down quilts, stewards were already bustling through corridors, cleaning cabins, folding linens, and preparing for the day's meals. There were about 421 stewards and stewardesses on Titanic, and their schedules were grueling. 16 to 17 hours a day, 7 days a week. Breaks were rare, and there was no such thing as a day off. Not when you had 2,200 passengers expecting luxury service. For stewards serving in first class, the job was a constant dance of politeness and precision. They carried luggage, delivered meals, and remembered passengers' quirks. Mrs. So-and-so only drank her tea with lemon. Mr. Whoever demanded his shoes polished to a mirror shine by breakfast. Mess it up, and you'd hear about it. Get it right, and you might be tipped, but still not paid anywhere near what the work deserved. Stewardesses had equally demanding tasks. They made beds, tidied rooms, looked after children, and occasionally acted as nursemaids to seasick passengers. They had to be cheerful, discreet, and above all, invisible. For many women, it was grueling labor, but it also offered a rare chance at steady pay and independence. at least while the voyage lasted. Then there were the cooks and galley workers, slaving away in the ship's massive kitchens. Titanic carried over 6,000 meals a day across 3 classes, which meant chefs and kitchen staff worked in an endless cycle of chopping, roasting, boiling, and baking. Imagine trying to prepare multi-course banquets for first class while simultaneously dishing out mountains of stew and potatoes for steerage, all on a tight schedule, all while the floor rocked under your feet. Life for the service staff was a strange contrast. On one hand, they lived closer to the passengers' luxury than the stokers in the engine rooms did. Their quarters were a little cleaner, their uniforms crisp, their work less dirty. But in another way, their lives were even harder. While firemen shoveled coal in shifts, service staff were essentially on call all the time. If a first-class passenger rang their bell at 2 a.m. because they wanted warm milk, you answered it, no questions asked. Pay wasn't great either. A steward might earn about 3 to 5 pounds a month, which is roughly $300 to $500 today, with room and board included. Tips helped, but only if passengers were generous, and not everyone was. The reality was that many crew joined not because it was glamorous, but because steady employment on a ship was better than employment on land. And just like the third-class passengers, the service staff were cut off by the rigid hierarchy of Titanic. Their cabins were cramped, their movements restricted, and their lives bound by rules. They could make your bed in the morning, serve you soup at noon, and polish your shoes by night, but they'd never be able to walk up the grand staircase as guests. The irony is, without them, the Titanic would never have been the ship of dreams. They were the ones who made sure the chandeliers sparkled, the tablecloths gleamed, and the first-class passengers could pretend they were sailing in heaven, all while the staff themselves were working in very different reality below deck. So let's talk about the engine room crew, the beating heart of the Titanic. If the service staff were the ship's hands, then the engine room crew were its lungs. These were the stokers, firemen, trimmers, and greasers, the men who lived in heat, soot, and constant noise. Their entire job is keeping the Titanic's mighty engines breathing. The Titanic's boilers were monstrous, 29 gigantic furnaces that devoured coal day and night. To feed them, the firemen shoveled around 600 tons of coal every single day. Picture it, row after row of men stripped to their undershirts, faces blackened, arms aching, shoveling coal into open flames that roared hot enough to sear your skin if you stood too close. The heat was unbearable, often climbing above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air, thick with coal dust, so heavy it coated your throat and lungs until coughing became second nature. The trimmers had the equally brutal job of moving coal from the bunkers to the firemen. Imagine hauling shovel after shovel of heavy, jagged black rock in tight, dark spaces, all while the floor trembled from the engines above. Their work was so exhausting that men often collapsed during their shifts. And then there were the greasers and engineers, the mechanics of the operation. Greasers kept the machinery running smoothly, constantly oiling gears and fixing breakdowns in deafening conditions. The engineers oversaw it all, masters of a steel labyrinth, making sure Titanic's engines never faltered. The shifts were punishing. Firemen and trimmers worked in 4-hour rotations with only a few hours to rest before heading back into the inferno. Their sleeping quarters were some of the worst on the ship. Cramped bunks and rooms that smelled of sweat, coal, and damp clothes that never fully dried. Pay was only slightly better than that of the service staff, but the conditions were far worse. A fireman earned about £6 a month, roughly $700 today, which sounds decent until you consider the physical toll. Many signed on not because they wanted to, but because it was the only steady work available in port cities like Southampton. And despite the hardship, these men, they were proud. They knew that without their labor, Titanic would be nothing but a floating hotel. It was their sweat, their burned lungs, their aching backs that turned the ship's great propellers and kept the lights glowing above deck. And when the disaster struck, they didn't abandon their posts. As the iceberg's damage became clear, many firemen and engineers stayed in the boiler rooms, fighting to keep the power running so that passengers could have light, and so the wireless operators could keep sending distress signals. Most of them never made it out. In fact, all but a handful of the 35 engineers went down with the ship, working until the very last moments. If first class was the glittering face of Titanic and steerage was its hopeful heart, then the engine crew were its unsung heroes, men who lived and died in the shadows, buried under coal dust, keeping the ship of dreams alive until her final breath. Life as a worker aboard the Titanic was not glamorous. Forget promenades, grand staircases, or deck chairs. If you wore a crew badge, your day was a never-ending cycle of labor, rules, exhaustion. Let's break it down. For the stewards and stewardesses, your day often began before dawn. As passengers slumbered peacefully, stewards were already scrubbing corridors, polishing brass handrails until they gleamed, and preparing cabins for morning tea. A steward could be expected to serve meals, haul luggage, shine shoes, deliver letters, and still be smiling politely, even after a 16-hour shift. Their routine wasn't neatly divided into work hours and rest hours. Instead, it was dictated by the whims of the passengers. A first-class guest ringing their cabin bell at midnight, you answered it. A second-class passenger requesting a special meal, you fetched it. A seasick traveler needing extra linens at 3 a.m., you delivered them. Meals for the staff weren't exactly fine dining either. Stewards ate in small mess halls below deck, on a tight schedule wedged between their duties. The food was basic: porridge, bread, stew, and you ate fast because in 10 minutes, you'd be back on your feet again. At night, when passengers finally retired, stewards often collapsed into their bunks. Their sleeping quarters were cramped, shared by several others, with little privacy and the constant hum of the ship as their lullaby. So what was a day like for the engine crew? Well, the men in the boiler rooms lived on a completely different schedule: shifts. They worked in watches, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. That meant 4 hours of relentless coal shoveling, sweating in blistering heat, swallowing soot with every breath, followed by 4 hours of rest that was more like recovery than relaxation. Then it was back to the fires. Rest wasn't restful. The firemen and trimmers bunked in noisy, stuffy quarters that smelled like damp clothes and coal dust. Their hands were raw, their lungs ached, and their bodies throbbed from hauling coal all day. But when the whistle blew, they dragged themselves back down into the bowels of the ship because, honestly, they didn't have a choice. Meals were eaten in hurried bites, thick stews, bread, tea, all served in their own mess hall, separate from the cleaner staff, like stewards. They needed heavy food. The work burned through the calories faster than they could replace them. And what about rules and discipline? For all the workers, life was governed by strict rules. Uniforms had to be spotless, manners had to be impeccable, orders from superiors were followed without question. The White Star Line demanded absolute professionalism, no matter how tired or overworked you were. There was little room for individuality. You weren't there to be seen or remembered. You were there to serve the passengers and keep the ship running. If you were a steward, you became part of the wallpaper, always present, never obtrusive. If you were an engineer or fireman, you were practically invisible, buried below decks in a world passengers never even thought of. So when you stack their daily routines side by side, the divide, it becomes clear. The stewards were public-facing, constantly smiling, bending, fetching, serving. Engine crew were hidden laborers, covered in sweat and soot, fighting a battle against coal and heat. Yet both groups shared one reality: exhaustion. Whether you were lugging silver trays or shoveling coal, you went to bed each night bone tired, knowing you'd wake up and do it all again tomorrow. Because for Titanic's workers, life aboard wasn't about luxury or leisure or dreams of America. It was about surviving each shift, collecting your wages, and praying for a better berth on the next voyage. If the first-class cabins were gilded hotel suites, the third-class bunks were simple but tidy, then the workers' quarters were something else entirely: bare bones, cramped, and designed with one purpose: function over comfort. The crew didn't live anywhere near the passenger decks. Their quarters were buried deep in the ship, often just above and even alongside the boiler in the engine rooms. That meant constant noise, the thrum of pistons, the roar of furnaces, the clang of shovels, and the occasional hiss of steam pipes. If you were lucky, after a few days, your ears tuned it out. If not, you just learned to sleep through the chaos. Stewards and stewardesses had it slightly better than the engine crew. Their bunks were in small cabins, usually shared with 6 to 2 others. Privacy was non-existent. Each person had a narrow bunk stacked against the wall, a thin mattress, a blanket, and maybe a small drawer or hook for their belongings. The air wasn't fresh, ventilation was poor, but it was at least cleaner than the firemen's quarters. Stewardesses' quarters smelled mostly of damp uniforms, polish, soap, and whatever food odors drifted down from the galleys. Stewardesses were given their own spaces, separate from the men, and their rooms were a touch more respectable, fewer bunks, slightly quieter, and sometimes even decorated with a curtain or a picture from home pinned to the wall. But still, comfort was minimal. Now the firemen, trimmers, and greasers, their living conditions were brutal. Their quarters were located near the coal bunkers and boiler rooms, so the smell of soot and sweat clung to everything. Imagine trying to sleep in a room that reeked of coal dust, where your clothes never fully dried, and the walls themselves seemed to sweat from the heat. Bunks were packed in tight, sometimes stacked 3 high, and the mattresses were little more than sacks of straw. Bedding was often damp, not from seawater, but from sweat and condensation. Clothes hung from pegs along the walls, blackened from coal dust, adding their own aroma to the mix. And because the men worked in 4-hour shifts, the rooms never truly went quiet. While one group stumbled in, peeling off soot-stained clothes and collapsing into bunks, another group was waking up, lacing boots, and heading back to the furnaces. Sleep was more like grabbing a nap in a revolving door. And each department had its own mess hall. The stewards ate together, the firemen had theirs, the officers had their own. Meals were served quickly in shifts with simple menus: porridge, bread, stew, salted meat, and tea. Nothing fancy, and certainly not comparable to what passengers ate, but hearty enough to fuel endless hours of labor. Socializing was minimal. Workers might swap stories, play cards, or smoke a quick pipe before duties. But with the grind of their schedules, leisure was rare. In short, for service staff, quarters were tight, plain, and busy, but at least they were tolerable. And for the engine crew, quarters were harsh, noisy, and suffocating. But what united both was fatigue. No matter your job, when you stumbled into your bunk at the end of your shift, you didn't care about the noise, the smell, or the lack of comfort. You just collapsed, dead tired, praying no passenger rang their bell or no whistle called you back down to the fire. For the passengers, Titanic was a floating palace. For the crew, it was more like a factory where your bed happened to be bolted to the wall. And when Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., most passengers barely felt a thing. But below decks, the workers knew instantly that something was wrong. The ship shuddered. Coal shifted violently in the bunkers. Some men were thrown from their bunks. Others thought one of the boilers had exploded. For the engine crew, there was no hesitation. Orders were shouted, whistles blew, and men rushed to their posts. Firemen tried to keep the boilers under control. Trimmers scrambled to move coal to balance the flooding, and engineers frantically inspected the damage. The ship's heart was bleeding, and they fought to keep it alive. The engineers, in particular, became unsung heroes. Instead of fleeing to the decks, they stayed deep below, working to keep Titanic's lights on and the wireless telegraph running so distress calls could be sent. That's why survivors later recalled how calm and eerily bright the ship remained until the very last minutes. The engineers bought them that time, and almost all of them paid with their lives. The service staff had their own battles. Stewards woke passengers, guided them to the decks, handed out life vests, and tried to maintain order in all the chaos. In third class, stewards became lifelines, leading bewildered families through confusing corridors, translating instructions for immigrants, and in some cases, physically carrying children to boats. But the brutal truth? For most workers, there was little chance of escape. The lifeboats were prioritized for passengers. The service staff, though they had spent days serving meals and making beds, were suddenly expendable. Many didn't even try to fight their way to the decks, instead staying with the people they'd been assigned to care for. In the boiler rooms, it was even worse. As the water rushed in, many firemen and trimmers were trapped almost immediately. Others worked until the lights flickered out, still feeding the fires, until they were swallowed by the Atlantic. Out of hundreds in the engine crew, only a fraction survived. When the Titanic finally split and slid beneath the waves, the passengers above screamed into the night, but deep below, the workers' voices were silenced, lost in the roar of rushing water and the collapse of steel. Their sacrifice remained largely invisible, just as their lives have been on board. So when we think of the Titanic, we often picture the glittering chandeliers, the grand staircase, and the wealthy elite who treated the ship like a floating palace. But the real story of life aboard wasn't just about luxury or tragedy. It was about the thousands of ordinary people who lived, worked, and dreamed on their decks. For the third-class passengers, Titanic was hope, the promise of a new life in America, a chance to escape poverty, even if it meant sleeping in crowded bunks and sharing a single bathroom with dozens of strangers. For the service staff, it was endless labor, polishing, serving, smiling through exhaustion, the invisible workforce that made the ship of dreams seem magical. And for the engine crew, Titanic was a furnace, sweat, soot, and sacrifice. Men who lived and died in the dark, fueling the great machine until the very end. In the very end, Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was an entire society of class, wealth, labor, and dreams, all crammed together on one doomed voyage. And when she went down, she took with her not just passengers, but the stories of those who kept her running. Their names aren't always remembered, their faces rarely appear in the movies, but without them, there would have been no Titanic at all. And perhaps that's the most haunting truth of it. The greatest ship ever built was carried not on steel, but on the backs of those who worked within her shadows. That's it for this video, you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I hope that you'll give it a like and subscribe. Good night. I'll see you in the morning.